London. President Trump began a two-day summit meeting on Tuesday to mark the 70th anniversary of NATO, an alliance that has been strained, in part, by his own brash handling of overseas allies, by lashing out at one of them. In a meeting with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary-General of NATO, Mr. Trump said President Emmanuel Macron of France had been a very insulting guy to the alliance when he warned recently about the brain death of NATO. Mr. Macron had suggested that Europe could no longer assume unwavering support from the United States. The two leaders were scheduled to meet later in the day. It's very disrespectful, Mr. Trump said, before adding, it's a very dangerous statement for them to make. Mr. Trump's visit comes as leaders across Europe struggle to balance the shared goal of combating the rising influence of global adversaries. China will be a main focus, and containing the whims of other unpredictable members, including President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey. Mr. Trump's defense of NATO against Mr. Macron's comments were something of a role reversal for the two leaders. In the past, Mr. Trump has been so disruptive at NATO meetings that he triggered an emergency session. A goal of the anniversary meeting was to avoid any formal disruptions this time around. This time, however, it was Mr. Macron's comments that were viewed as unhelpful to the alliance. Heather Conley, director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, said Mr. Macron sees an opportunity to assert French leadership in Europe, with Britain moving toward leaving the European Union and the German government enmeshed in its own political troubles. President Macron is seizing that moment, seeking to be disruptive in his own way, and so we will see how that works, she said. In the background of these competing global interests is Mr. Trump's impeachment, which threatens to throw off his focus and overshadow a victorious message that administration officials brought along with them to Britain. Last week, officials told reporters that the president had been spectacularly successful in urging allies to increase their military spending by around $100 billion. Of course, those allies have their own priorities. Mr. Trump is scheduled on Tuesday to meet one-on-one with Mr. Macron, who has shifted from a charm offensive with Mr. Trump to a more confrontational approach. Later on Tuesday, Mr. Trump will also meet with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada and host a private roundtable with his supporters. Notably absent from the president's schedule is a one-on-one meeting with the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who is days away from an election and is struggling to manage the political fallout from after a lone extremist fatally stabbed two people in central London on Friday. Mr. Johnson has been desperate to keep Mr. Trump at arm's length. The effort became a political lightning rod, with the left opposing a new generation of standardized tests tied to the core, and the right seeing the effort as an unwelcome intrusion into local control of schools. Some states that initially signed on to the core later rejected it. Even in those places that stuck with the effort, the curricular changes that flowed from the Common Core could be made without necessarily improving the quality of teaching, Professor Koretz said. He suggested a renewed focus on classroom instruction, and on providing students and families who are poor, or are recent immigrants, with support like social workers and translators. The most recent PISA test was given in 2018 to 600,000 15-year-olds in 79 education systems around the world, and included both public and private school students. In the United States, a demographically representative sample of 4,800 students from 215 schools took the test, which is given every 3 years. Although math and science were also tested, about half of the questions were devoted to reading, the focus of the 2018 exam. Students were asked to determine when written evidence supported a particular claim and to distinguish between fact and opinion, among other tasks. The top performers in reading were 4 provinces of China: Beijing, Shanghai, Jiangsu, and Zhejiang. Also outperforming the United States were Singapore, Macau, Hong Kong, Estonia, Canada, Finland, and Ireland. The United Kingdom, Japan, and Australia performed similarly to the United States. Among the countries that demonstrated improvement on the test were Portugal, Peru, and Colombia. There were some bright spots for the United States. Achievement gaps between native-born and immigrant students were smaller than such gaps in peer nations. Mr. Schleicher, of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, said it was a common misconception that socioeconomic achievement gaps in the United States were much larger than those in the rest of the world. 3% of American children from poor families were top performers in reading, compared with an average of 4% of poor children among OECD countries. In math, socioeconomic status explained 16% of the variation in American performance, similar to the average of 14% across OECD nations. Mr. Schleicher said that differences in school quality affected the performance of American students less than it affected the performance of students in many other nations, meaning that in the United States, there is more achievement diversity within schools than across schools. Some education leaders said they saw no reason to drastically change policy directions. William G. McCallum, a mathematician and one of the lead writers of the Common Core State Standards, said he remained hopeful that a strategy of rigorous standards, quality classroom materials and effective teacher training could improve student achievement. He noted that Washington, D.C., which has been committed to the Common Core, had recently demonstrated impressive performance gains. A frustration is understandable, he said of low test results. But, he added, maybe this is just a really hard problem.